All right, to give you a little taste there of the Mexican national anthem. Let's kick off Mexico here, part one. We're going to talk a little bit about the history, so the making of the modern state, how Mexico got to be where it is today. So first have to ask ourselves, why do we study Mexico? Well, it's a great example to fit into our AP6. It has a history of revolution, one of the great examples of regime change. It has been dominated for a long time by a single party. It also has a history, a record of authoritarianism. But as we'll see, as you've read a little bit already, it has ended its one-party rule. It's becoming more democratized, and now it's considered in that category of newly industrializing countries with some of the other countries that we'll talk about. But as we see, still many problems exist in the Mexican state. All right, a little bit of geography to start things off. It is one of the most geographically diverse countries in the world. High mountains, coastal plains, high plateaus, very fertile valleys, rainforests, deserts within an area about 3 times the size of France. But geographically, it's slightly less than 3 times the size of Texas. So great diversity geographically in Mexico. It's got 2,000 miles of border with the United States, 600 miles of border with Guatemala, and 160 miles of border with Belize. Its major natural resources are oil and silver. Silver, as you can remember, all the way back to when the Spanish came over. So something to think about, and you can pause the video here if you want. How was Mexico geographically impacted? How has Mexico's geography impacted its development? Think about the diversity that we mentioned on the previous slide. Mountains and deserts have separated different regions, which over time has made communication and transportation between those regions difficult. The terrain, certainly in certain parts of the country, has limited its ability to have widespread agriculture, although it does have some in some regions. All this feeds into a regionalism in its political culture, again, based on these physical geography factors. Population of about 114 million makes Mexico the second largest country in Latin America. Ethnically, about 60% of the population is mestizo, and that's going to be part mixed Amerindian and part of Spanish descent. 30% Amerindian, which is the indigenous population. It is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. 92.7% of its population speaks Spanish. 5.7% speaks a combination of Spanish and indigenous, and a very small percentage speaks the indigenous language. And as we touch on a little bit here, but certainly as we see for my AP Human Geography folks, a lot of those native languages on a much smaller scale are disappearing. 78% of the population lives in urban areas, so a little bit less than we've seen in some other countries that we've looked at. Mexico City in and of itself has 20 million people, so it is a mega city. Religiously, 83% of the population is Catholic, so it remains a very Catholic country. The northern part of the state, much better off economically than the southern and the central areas, and that's going to cause some problems and create some issues as well. In the southern and the central regions, the population is much more dense. The quality of the land, especially for agriculture, is less. There are more ejidatorios in the central and southern regions, and these are basically areas where the government, in sort of a collective kind of way, lets people use the land for agriculture. So they have the right to use the land to grow product, but the land is actually held by the Mexican state. Most of the indigenous population that remains in Mexico still lives in the south. Migration, especially in the last 50 years, has been a significant issue. Remember, economically, the northern regions are more economically successful. There are greater economic opportunities in the north. The industrial cities of the north leads many to internally migrate to the north looking for jobs in those maquiladores, and those are basically the assembly factories. We'll talk a little bit about NAFTA, but what NAFTA created was the ability for goods, unfinished goods, to move back and forth across the border between Mexico and the United States without paying tariffs. Now, what that meant was for the lower cost labor in Mexico, a lot of the automobile and other assembly happened in Mexico. So those are by and large the maquiladores in Mexico, but along the Texas border. And those are the factory jobs that a lot in the central and southern part are looking for. Obviously, when we talk about Mexico, we have to talk about the history of colonialism. Spain ruled Mexico for just over 300 years. Colonial policy was designed to extract, like any colony, extract raw materials, certainly precious metals, from New Spain. The road to independence began in 1810. Miguel Hidalgo began a series of wars looking for Mexican independence. By 1821, Mexico finally gained its independence, but it's going to struggle significantly to create a stable government for decades after that. So between 1833 and 1855, there were 36 different presidential administrations that came to power. That's quite a turnstile of leadership. In many of the regions, local strongmen, warlords or caudillos, had more authority than the government and more practical authority on the ground than the government had. Parts of the southern parts of Mexico, Central America, rejected being ruled from Mexico City in 1823, and they broke away. The Northern Territory of Texas, as we know from our APUSH and U.S. history last year, won their independence from Mexico in 1836. Texas becomes a state in 1845, and then in 1848 we have the Mexican Cession, so the treaty that gives the United States New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, and part of Colorado as well. So even though it gains independence in 1821, you can see it's still a very chaotic period, both in terms of the territory that it governs, but also in terms of the governance of that territory. All right, so the period of the Porfiriato, 1876 to 1911, is basically the time of dictatorship under Porfirio Diaz. He was a retired general. He instituted himself as the president of Mexico on a promise that he would not serve more than one term. Turns out that he ended up serving 34 years, a lot different once you get into the seat of power. Came to power by a military coup, again, ruled for 34 years. He did give them a period of stability, but he also ruled from a very authoritarian perspective. So he ruled with a group of scientificos, as they were called, and these were basically scientists, so young advisors, both economic and science experts, a group of young advisors that they believed that in order to bring progress to Mexico, you had to base things on science. Under Diaz, significant foreign investment was allowed into the country, a lot of that coming from the United States. So we saw in that 34-year period rapid, significant growth and development in Mexico. The problem is with this introduction of wealth and development, it wasn't distributed evenly. So it wasn't ensured that all would benefit. So we had some elite that became very wealthy, but most of the people in Mexico remained poor. So we had a significant gap between the haves and the have-nots. So in 1910, we had a revolution. So a group of reformers brings an end to the dictatorship of Diaz. In 1910, Diaz had promised to retire, and he opened the election for president. 1910, Madero presented himself as a candidate. He was backed by this group of reformers. Diaz ends up changing his mind. He cancels the election due to increasing opposition to his policies, but he was too late. Diaz ultimately ends up being forced into exile, and Madero is elected president. Madero resorts to the military to suppress and put down other groups of revolutionaries that may not have agreed with his policies, with his ideas. But Madero himself is assassinated 3 years later in 1913, and what began as a revolution in 1910 turns into a civil war in 1913. So what we see then here is the rise of the Caudillos, political military strongman, you could call them warlords, challenging each other for power. On one side, we've got Emiliano Zapata coming from the south, representing the interests of the peasants, actually the central and the southern states. His manifesto, sort of standing up for the underclasses, became the manifesto of radical agrarian, so the peasant and the agricultural reform. In the north, that group, interest group, was represented by Pancho Villa, or Francisco Pancho Villa, in the north, with a lot of significant support from the military, and again, a lot of, and both sides were acting as military strongmen or warlords. In 1917, we have a Mexican Constitution forged out of a very diverse and conflicting factions of the revolution. So it was an effort to try to unite these disparate groups. The Constitution of 1917 guarantees agrarian reform, certainly what they wanted in the South, Social Security, the right of laborers to organize in unions, which was significant, guarantees a minimum wage, guarantees an 8-hour workday, guarantees universal secular education, and also guarantees adult male suffrage. Interestingly, women are not going to get the right to vote in national elections in Mexico until 1958. We also see after the Constitution of 1917 a limitation on the power of foreign investment. Only Mexican citizens and the government were allowed to own land or rights to other natural resources within the country. Certainly, this is a reaction to significant U.S. investment, other countries investing as well, but kind of taking it back to make it more under the control of the Mexican people. The Constitution also limits the power of the Catholic Church. There was a significant level of anti-clericalism, opposition to the still significant power that the church and the clergy had in the political sphere. Okay, this is also the time where we see the beginning of the PRI, so Plutarco Elias Calles. 1924 establishes the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. Actually, 1929 is when he brings together many of the most powerful contenders for leadership to create this political party. The idea was to bring all these powerful caudillos under one big political party, intended to bring stability to the state through an agreement to pass around the power from one leader to the next as the presidency changed hands. And under this arrangement, each president would have only a 6-year term, and other leaders would be given major positions within the government. After Calles, we have Lázaro Cárdenas, was the hand-picked successor for President by Calles. Sometimes Cárdenas is called the Roosevelt of Mexico. He gave voice to the revolutionary demands of the peasants, and that was primarily a redistribution of the land so that they could have some land that they could use to feed their families for their own benefit. So one of the key policies or programs was the redistribution of the land. So land taken away from the big landlords and certainly from foreign interests as well, redistribute as ejidos, which are collective land grants to be worked by the peasants. So this is what we mentioned in the beginning, where the peasants don't own the land, but they've got the grant and the right to work the land. We also see the nationalization of the oil industry in this time frame under Cárdenas with Pemex, and oil is going to be a significant contributor to the national economy, and we'll talk more about Pemex as we go forward. And we see economically a policy of import substitution industrialization, as it's called. And basically, this was an effort to protect local products, domestic goods, from foreign competition. Think of it if in terms of self-sufficiency, one of the things I know we talk about in human geography, where they want to protect local businesses and foster their own development. So high tariffs, protect locally produced goods from foreign, outside, less expensive maybe products. The government has key ownership in certain key industries, and they've highlighted that industry, in this case being oil. And the government subsidizes other domestic industries in order to get them sort of going on the right foot. So in this time frame, we have a system that is defined as clientelism. So clientelism, again, I've got it in the notes, an informal aspect of policymaking in which a power patron offers resources such as land, contracts, protection, or jobs in return for the support and the services such as labor or votes of lower status and less powerful clients. So this is the way in which PRI gets power and holds on to power, basically by rewarding jobs and contracts to people that would agree to keep it in power and to vote for the party. One of the problems, one of the downsides of a clientelistic strategy is a lot of corruption comes in. You got preferential treatment, significant inequality. These are characteristics that aren't just unique to Mexico, but anywhere you see clientelism, you're going to have an increase in this type of situation. So largely driven by oil from the 1940s to the 1980s. Obviously, in different time frames, your prices are going to fluctuate. Good years or good periods, bad periods, and you're going to have times when it's a real challenge. In the 80s, we have a period of crisis. So Presidents Madrid and Salinas changed the direction of the country's development strategy, limiting the government's involvement in the economy. So a little more of a hands-off approach, if you will. So from import substitution to neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is a little more, again, laissez-faire, free markets, balanced budgets, privatization of industry, so no state operated industries, free trade, limited regulation in the economy. So a significant shift in terms of development strategy. Then in 1994, you've got NAFTA introduced, North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, which basically eliminates any trade barriers between. So the political borders no longer matter in terms of the transportation of goods. This is one of the things that drives what we mentioned before, those maquiladores, where car parts might be manufactured in the U.S., delivered to northern Mexico for assembly, where it's very labor intensive, and then shipped back into the United States, going back and forth across the border without any kind of tariffs. In 1994, we've got an economic crisis, a global economic crisis. Globalization, the increased connectivity around the globe leads to greater economic vulnerability. We've also got politically internal to Mexico, a rebellion in the Chiapas region. The Zapatistas in the south seized 4 towns in the southern state of Chiapas, demanding land, greater democracy, greater rights for the indigenous population, and the repeal of NAFTA. Again, remember, the northern region was benefiting much more from NAFTA than they were in the south. We also saw the assassination of Luis Donaldo Colosio in 1994, who was the PRI candidate for president. During this period of time, 1994, the Mexican economy shrank by 6.2%. Inflation soared, taxes rose, and wages end up being frozen. In 1997, the first time we see in modern Mexican history the PRI candidate, again, the PRI had dominated since its inception, lost the absolute majority in the Chamber of Deputies, which is the lower house in the legislature. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. December 1st, 2000, Vicente Fox becomes president. Why is this change away from the PRI important? Well, again, you'll see this in the notes. Mexicans questioned the right of the PRI to monopolize political power. They wanted to have more voice, a greater voice in politics. They wanted more fair elections. They wanted public officials that were more responsive to the needs of the people. They demanded the right to have opposition parties to compete with the PRI on an equal basis. They believed that the president had too much power and that the PRI, because they'd been around so long, because they'd been so powerful, they were more corrupt. They weren't quite ready for the change in 1994 when the PRI candidate Zedillo won easily, but by 2000 they'd had enough and Vicente Fox was elected. Just want to go back to that previous slide here for just a second. Vicente Fox was a member of the National Action Party, or the PAN party. The third major party in Mexico is the PRD, and again, we'll talk about political parties and institutions tomorrow. So in 2000, Vicente Fox was the PAN party candidate, and he was successful in winning the election. 2006, Felipe Calderon, the second PAN president. The 2006 election was contested by AMLO, who we'll talk about, Obrador, the current president today, who at that time was a member of the PRD party. 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto of the PRI party is elected president. He's the one you see there on the right. And then, as you've read about already, in July of 2018, we have sort of a left field candidate, certainly been around for a while, but now he's the leader of his own party, no longer a member of the PRI. He's from the Morena party. AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, wins 53.2% of the votes, so significant, you can see there, and also his party wins significant seats in the Chamber of Deputies, again, which we'll talk about in the next institutions discussion.